It started on the coldest night of the year. The wind howled through the barren trees and the ground was frozen solid beneath a layer of fresh snow. I was trudging home from town, the soles of my boots crunching with every step. The storm had crept in faster than expected, reducing the world to a gray blur. Then I saw it, the first puddle. It was shallow, an icy depression in the road, but it caught my eye because of the reflection. In it I saw myself, but not as I should have been. My reflection moved before I did. It raised its arm, pointed toward me, then smiled. A slow, deliberate grin that didn't belong to me. I staggered back, nearly losing my footing. The puddle froze solid before my eyes, the reflection vanishing into the ice. My heart pounded as I pressed forward, determined to reach the safety of my home. But the storm was relentless, and soon the woods closed in around me. The second puddle was just outside the clearing near my cabin. This time I was prepared, or so I thought. My reflection stared up at me, its head tilted unnaturally. When I bent down to inspect it, it whispered, not with sound, but with a movement of its lips. Words I couldn't hear, but that I understood nonetheless. Come closer. I stumbled away, breath fogging in the frigid air, and rushed inside. Slamming the door behind me, I locked it and leaned against the wood, my pulse racing. The warmth of the cabin offered no comfort. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift. Every creak of the floorboards a reminder that I was no longer alone. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind battered the windows and the fire in the hearth seemed dimmer than usual. I glanced toward the window and froze. Outside, in the snow-covered yard, a series of puddles reflected the moonlight, each one shimmering unnaturally. In every one, my reflection stood staring back at me. I turned away, shutting my eyes, but the image was burned into my mind. When I looked again, the puddles were closer, encircling the cabin. I couldn't bring myself to look directly at them, but I knew they were there. My reflections moving independently, closing in. The next morning, the puddles were gone, replaced by smooth, untouched snow. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the horizon for any sign of what I had seen. The air was biting cold, but the storm had abated, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. I decided to venture into the woods, thinking I could clear my head. The trees were skeletal, their branches weighted with frost. As I walked, I noticed more puddles forming in the shadows. Each one shimmered like glass, and in every one, my reflection waited. This time, they were not still. They mimicked my movements, but slower, more deliberate, as if mocking me. One puddle stood out. It was larger, almost a small pond, and its surface was perfectly smooth. My reflection in it wasn't mimicking me. It stood still, its eyes locked onto mine. Then, with a sudden jerk, it reached out toward the edge of the puddle. I stumbled back, falling into the snow. When I looked again, the reflection was gone, but the icy surface bore the faint impression of a handprint. I ran. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees bending and groaning as if alive. The puddles multiplied, appearing on every path I took. They weren't just reflecting me anymore. They showed things I hadn't done yet. Turning my head, falling to my knees, looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached the cabin, I bolted the door and drew the curtains. The whispers began soon after, faint and chilling, seeping through the walls. They weren't words, just a guttural murmur that made my skin crawl. The puddles were outside again, closer than before. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the fire, on the clock ticking above the mantel. But the reflections wouldn't leave my mind. I felt them watching, waiting. My breath fogged in the cold air as the temperature inside dropped unnaturally fast. Frost crept along the windows, forming jagged patterns that resembled faces. The puddles were inside the cabin now. I noticed them first in the corners of the room, small patches of ice that shouldn't have been there. My reflection stared out from them, unmoving, their eyes empty and cold. One by one, the puddles grew, spreading across the floor like veins. I grabbed a poker from the hearth and smashed the nearest puddle. The ice shattered, But the reflection didn't disappear. It lingered, a faint, ghostly image hovering above the shards before fading into the air. The other puddles began to ripple as though disturbed by an unseen force. The whispers grew louder, turning into a deafening hum. The frost spread faster, climbing the walls and ceiling. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. Then, from the largest puddle, my reflection rose. It pulled itself from the ice like a creature emerging from water, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was me, but wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its smile was twisted. I backed away, heart hammering, as it took a step toward me. The other puddles began to shimmer, and more reflections started to rise. The cabin filled with them, all staring, all moving closer. Desperation took over. I grabbed the kerosene can from the corner and doused the floor, the walls, everything within reach. Striking a match, I hesitated only for a moment before throwing it onto the soaked wood. Flames roared to life, consuming the frost, driving back the cold. The reflections shrieked, a sound that vibrated through my skull. They dissolved into the air as the fire spread, their forms twisting and breaking apart. The frost melted, retreating from the heat, and for the first time in days, I felt warmth. The cabin burned, but I didn't care. I stumbled out into the snow, collapsing in the clearing as the flames consumed it. The puddles were gone, their icy surfaces reduced to steam. The forest was still, the storm having finally broken. For a moment, I thought it was over. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting a faint glow over the snow. But then I saw it, a single puddle, glistening at the edge of the woods. My reflection stood in it, smiling. I turned and walked away, leaving the cabin and the forest behind. I had escaped, but I knew it wasn't the end. The puddles would find me again. They always would.